The Interstellar Survival Academy sat perched on the third plateau of Kepler 442b, like a monument to bureaucratic overconfidence, all gleaming metal and self-importance, designed by a committee that had clearly never experienced actual hardship. For 3 centuries, it had churned out survival specialists who could operate 47 different models of emergency shelter fabricators, but couldn't start a fire without a plasma torch. The Academy's motto, emblazoned in 17 languages across its entrance dome, read, "Technology conquers all environments." Someone should have mentioned that motto to the mud. The annual Primitive Environment Challenge was the Academy's crown jewel, a tradition so sacred that cadets spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones, usually reserved for funeral services or particularly disappointing cafeteria meals. This year's batch of recruits represented the finest survival prospects from across 8 sectors, which was either a testament to the galaxy's educational standards or a damning indictment of them, depending on your perspective. The challenge was simple, in the way that jumping off a cliff with homemade wings is simple. Build a functional shelter in 6 hours, using only provided materials. Functionality would be tested via simulated environmental hazards. Failure meant remedial classes and the crushing weight of intergalactic shame. Instructor Kickstal, a Vendorian whose exoskeleton had seen more combat than most warships, surveyed the assembled cadets with the expression of someone who'd just discovered their star cruiser had been valeted by teenagers. 40 years of teaching had granted them precisely 0 faith in youth, technology, or the universe's sense of humor. They'd seen cadets arrive with credentials that could wallpaper a small apartment and survival instincts that couldn't wallpaper a postage stamp. This year's challenge location, Kickstal announced, their translator rendering their clicking speech into deadpan standard, is Sector 7 Gamma, floodplain region. High clay content soil, minimal vegetation. Your shelters must withstand Category 3 wind simulation and sustained precipitation. They paused, mandibles twitching in what might have been amusement. Try not to die. It generates paperwork. The challenge site looked like the galaxy's saddest beach, all brown mud and disappointment, stretching toward a horizon that seemed personally offended by their presence. 4 cadets stood at designated starting points, each separated by 50 meters of squelching misery. Vex of Crystallus Prime represented their species' long tradition of geometric perfection and structural obsession. They resembled an ambulatory chandelier designed by someone with strong opinions about angles, their translucent body refracting light into calculations. Vex had scored perfect marks in advanced shelter engineering, structural integrity theory, and being insufferable at parties. Their thesis on load-bearing crystalline matrices had been called revolutionary by 3 professors and unnecessarily complicated by everyone who'd actually read it. Thromp hailed from Aqueous Secundus, where having 6 arms was considered baseline and using fewer than 4 simultaneously was considered lazy. Their gelatinous form rippled with barely contained enthusiasm, each appendage already twitching toward the toolbox they'd be assigned. Thromp had grown up in underwater construction, where buildings assembled themselves through coordinated limb choreography that would make dance instructors weep. On land, they moved like someone trying to conduct 6 orchestras while juggling. Zend. The name was technically 47 clicks and a frequency shift, but the translator had given up, came from a hive species where individual thought was a hobby and collective building knowledge was genetic memory. They looked like someone had given a mantis shrimp military funding and architectural ambitions. Their species had constructed megastructures spanning star systems using mathematical precision and millions of coordinated workers. Alone, Zentist carried that entire legacy and the crushing anxiety that came with it. Then there was the human. Humans had joined the galactic community 2 decades prior with the diplomatic grace of a meteor strike, immediately making themselves simultaneously indispensable and irritating. They fixed things that weren't broken, broke things that were fixed, and approached every regulation as a polite suggestion awaiting creative reinterpretation. The Academy had admitted its first human cadet 3 years ago. That particular experiment had ended with a reprogrammed food synthesizer, a philosophical crisis among the janitorial staff, and new rules about improvisation. This human, introduced simply as the Terran recruit, stood examining the mud with an expression suggesting they'd found it personally fascinating, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd looked confident. Kickstal approached each cadet with their assigned equipment. To Vex, they handed a molecular bonding kit that could fuse materials at the atomic level. To Thromp, a self-assembling shelter framework with smart adhesive panels. To Kixt, a construction algorithm processor linked to a nanite deployment system. Each kit represented the cutting edge of survival technology, tools that would make ancient peoples weep with envy or possibly confusion. The human received nothing. Equipment malfunction, Vex asked, their voice like wind chimes having an existential crisis. No malfunction, Kickstal replied. The human requested no tools. Direct order from their file. They consulted their datapad. Exact quote, "We've got hands. That's basically a universal toolkit." Thromp's 6 arms froze mid-gesture. They're going to build with appendages. Apparently, Kizantena vibrated confusion. But the structural calculations alone require... I don't write the rules, Kizantol interrupted. I just watch cadets discover why the rules exist. You have 6 hours. Begin. The cadets scattered to their zones like contestants in the universe's most stressful game show. Vex immediately began unpacking their molecular bonder with the reverence of a priest handling holy relics. Their species thought in equations, dreamed in blueprints, and approached problems with the assumption that sufficient complexity equaled superiority. They designed their shelter 3 weeks ago, a geodesic dome utilizing interlocking crystalline panels with load distribution optimized for 17 different stress scenarios. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It would have made engineers across the galaxy weep with jealous rage. The first panel materialized perfectly, its molecular structure humming with precise atomic alignment. Vex placed it carefully, began the second. The design called for 47 panels, each bonded at exact angles. Simple, efficient, foolproof. Panel 3 bonded at 89.4 degrees instead of 90. The cascade failure was almost artistic. Panel 1's stress calculations had assumed Panel 3's perfection. Panel 3's imperfection redistributed force to Panel 2, which wasn't designed for lateral stress. Panel 2 cracked. Panel 1's molecular bonds, suddenly supporting unexpected weight, began separating. The entire structure sang one crystalline note of structural despair and collapsed into a pile of very expensive rubble. Vex stood motionless, processing. Their entire worldview had just been murdered by 0.6 degrees. Thromp, meanwhile, had deployed their self-assembling framework with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered Murphy's Law. The framework was a miracle of engineering, smart joints that calculated optimal positions, panels that adhered automatically, support struts that adjusted for weight distribution. Watching it assemble itself was like watching the future arrive early and slightly drunk. The problem with having 6 arms is the temptation to use all 6 simultaneously. Thromp grabbed tools, panels, supports, and adjustment controls, conducting a symphony of construction that would have been impressive if any single element had been correct. They tightened the wrong bolts, loosened the right ones, attached panels backwards, and adjusted supports that didn't need adjusting while ignoring ones that desperately did. The framework assembled itself into something that technically qualified as three-dimensional. Whether it qualified as shelter was a theological question. It looked like abstract art designed by a committee during an earthquake, all jutting angles and panels attached with more hope than structural integrity. One strong breeze would send it to shelter heaven. Thromp stepped back, surveying their work with 4 eyes, while 2 others double-checked the instructions they definitely should have read first. "That's architecturally bold," they muttered. Gust had approached the challenge with algorithmic precision, which worked spectacularly in theory. They'd activated their nanite deployment system, uploaded construction parameters, and watched billions of microscopic builders swarm forth to create a shelter through collective effort. It was how their species had built everything for millennia. Trust the algorithm, trust the collective, trust the process. The algorithm had opinions. Specifically, it had opinions about optimal shelter configuration based on environmental data, structural requirements, and about 47 other variables that Gust had forgotten to properly constrain. The nanites built enthusiastically, creating walls that curved at unexpected angles, a roof that was technically optional, and support structures that supported things that didn't exist. The shelter grew organically, like a building having an identity crisis. Gust frantically input corrections. The nanites obeyed with the literal mindedness of computer programs everywhere, undoing half their work to accommodate new parameters, which created new problems, which required new corrections. It was an iterative process, destined to continue until heat death or timeout, whichever came first. "Stop building the door inside the walls." Gust clicked desperately. The nanites, lacking context for sarcasm, continued their work. The human, observed by all 3 cadets and instructor Kickstal with varying degrees of confusion, had spent the first 30 minutes just walking the perimeter, squatting in the mud, picking up handfuls of clay-rich soil and squeezing it experimentally. They wore the expression of someone having a pleasant conversation with geology. Then they started digging. Not sophisticated excavation, not calculated foundation preparation. Just hands in mud, scooping, shaping, piling. They dug a shallow depression, mounded earth around its perimeter, and began forming mud into rough bricks, using nothing but palms and fingers. Each brick got placed carefully, pressed into position, smoothed. They worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this before, or was too stubborn to acknowledge they hadn't. "Are they playing?" Vex asked, watching between attempts to salvage their panel disaster. "I think they're building," Thromp replied, 6 arms tangled in framework that had achieved sentience and chosen chaos. "With mud," TZ added, the disbelief evident even through translator clicks. The human continued, unbothered by commentary. They'd found a rhythm, scoop, form, place, smooth. The walls grew incrementally, curving inward. They packed mud into gaps, used water from a nearby puddle to make clay more workable, reinforced weak points with additional layers. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd done this 1,000 times in species memory. Hours passed. The alien cadets cycled through emotions, confidence, confusion, frustration, panic, resignation. Their shelters existed in states ranging from technically present to philosophical question. The human's shelter grew. They'd shaped it into a dome, using the mud's natural properties for structural integrity. Curved walls distributed weight. Thick base provided stability. They'd left a small entrance, angled away from prevailing winds. The interior stayed dim but dry. No right angles, no perfect measurements, nothing that would win architectural awards. Just functional shelter, built from local materials, using the galaxy's oldest construction method, determination and opposable thumbs. They even added a small channel around the perimeter for water drainage, which suggested either experience or lucky paranoia. As the 6-hour mark approached, the cadets stood beside their creations, with expressions ranging from hopeful to doomed. Keekstall approached each shelter with a structural analyzer and the enthusiasm of someone evaluating disaster sites. Vex's crystalline panels lay in an artistic pile. Structural integrity, 0, Keekstall announced. On the positive side, its very shiny rubble. Thromp's framework leaned at angles that defied physics and good sense. This appears to be held together by optimism and 2 bolts. Structural integrity, aspirational. TZ's nanite creation had achieved something that might technically qualify as shelter if judged by particularly generous aliens. The algorithm has built you a modern art installation. Structural integrity, debatable. Then Keekstall reached the humans' mud hut. They circled it slowly, scanner humming. The humans stood nearby, covered in dried mud, looking like they'd lost a fight with a clay golem. The shelter sat there being aggressively humble, just brown, simple, and utterly unpretentious. "Well," Keekstall said finally, "it's definitely a structure." The simulation started without ceremony. Wind generators roared to life, creating Category 3 gusts that would test any shelter's determination to remain upright. Rain came next, artificial but enthusiastic, the kind of downpour that made you question your life choices. Vex's panel pile didn't notice the weather, being already maximally disassembled. Thromp's framework achieved liftoff within 30 seconds, panels separating in different directions like a family during an awkward reunion. It landed 50 meters away in pieces, which at least made cleanup easier. Kizt's algorithmic shelter experienced what could only be described as an identity crisis. The nanites, detecting structural stress, attempted emergency repairs that somehow made things worse. The building didn't so much collapse as decide existence was overrated. It folded inward with the resigned grace of someone giving up on a puzzle. The humans' mud hut sat there like a particularly stubborn boulder. Wind hit it, flowed around the curved walls. Rain pelted it, ran down the dome, channeled away through drainage grooves. The structure absorbed stress, distributed force, and remained aggressively present. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't sophisticated. It absolutely undeniably worked. The simulation ended. Silence descended, broken only by rain dripping from various surfaces, and Thromp's framework pieces settling into their final resting positions. Keekstall checked their scanner. Human shelter fully functional. Maintained structural integrity throughout testing. Interior remains dry. Projected durability, several weeks minimum. They looked at the human, then at the other cadets. Questions. Vex's translucent form flickered confusion. How is mud more effective than molecular bonding? Because mud doesn't care about bond angles, the human replied, scraping clay off their fingers. It just wants to stick to other mud. Simple material, simple method, simple result. But the engineering calculations, Kizd began, don't really matter if you over-engineer it, the human interrupted. Sometimes the oldest solution is oldest because it works. Humans built with mud for thousands of years, still standing in some places, can't argue with results. Thromp gestured with multiple arms at their scattered framework. But we had advanced tools. Yeah, and I had hands and pattern recognition. The human shrugged. Plus, I've watched way too many primitive building videos. You pick things up. Keekstall's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Let's review. The cadet with centuries of engineering knowledge created expensive debris. The cadet with 6 arms and smart tools built modern art. The cadet with algorithmic construction protocols confused their nanites into an existential crisis. The human with no tools built functional shelter using materials they found on the ground. That about covers it. The human agreed. The lesson, Keekstall continued, addressing all cadets, is that survival doesn't care about sophistication. It cares about results. You can have the best tools in the galaxy, but if you don't understand fundamentals, you'll fail in the mud. Literally. They gestured at the various disasters. The humans succeeded because they matched method to materials and environment. They didn't try to impose complex solutions on simple problems. Vex's form dimmed with embarrassment. We overcomplicated it. You overcomplicated it spectacularly. Keekstall agreed. Which is tradition among first-time cadets. Usually someone builds a shelter that calculates pi to 1,000 decimal places, but can't keep out rain. The human had started disassembling their mud hut, carefully so the walls wouldn't damage the ground. It's just mud. It'll wash back into the soil. No waste, no cleanup required. Sustainable too, Keekstall noted. Full marks, human. The rest of you, remedial classes on fundamental shelter principles. We'll start with walls should stay walls and progress from there. As the cadets trudged back toward the academy, 3 dejected, 1 muddy but satisfied, Keekstall filed their report. Another year, another batch of cadets learning that technology was a tool, not a crutch. The galaxy had spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated solutions to ancient problems, sometimes forgetting that ancient solutions had survived for reasons beyond nostalgia. Humans, having arrived late to the galactic party, brought with them a refreshing combination of primitive knowledge and complete disregard for doing things the proper way. They fixed star drives with improvised tools, solved complex problems with simple solutions, and built functional shelters out of mud, while everyone else was reading instruction manuals. The Academy's motto, "Technology conquers all environments," remained emblazoned across the entrance dome, gleaming and confident. Someone really should have added an asterisk, unless you're competing against a human with opposable thumbs and a comfort with being covered in mud. In the distance, the human's shelter sat in the floodplain for another day before rains finally reclaimed it, the mud returning to Earth like it had never been disturbed. No trace remained except scanner readings and 1 perfectly scored evaluation in the Academy records. Somewhere in the universe, ancient humans who'd built the first shelters from river clay would have recognized the technique immediately. They might have laughed at the 6-hour time limit, the advanced alien observers, and the sheer bureaucratic ceremony surrounding the simple act of stacking mud into walls. But they definitely have approved of the results. The mud, indifferent to galactic politics and technological advancement, continued being mud. It remained the galaxy's most humble building material, and apparently one of its most effective teachers.